Welcome to the Church Safety Guys broadcast with hosts James McCarthy, Paul Buckner, and Mike Scully. Together, they make up the Church Safety Guys. Their mission to inspire, influence, and impact church safety teams. Join us for the next hour as we talk about all things church safety and security. Don't forget to like our Facebook page, join one of our church safety and security communities online, and share this broadcast with your church.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Sunday night broadcast of the Church Safety Guys. I am James, and I am joined by my co-hosts, Mike and Paul.
You're never on the right from my perspective.
How's that go? Am I driving tonight?
Well, the world is now back in its correct place because I was able to switch it. What happens is, and you folks watching, you'll see a little bit of our background tech stuff. But what happens is we have an extra guest on tonight. So when I click to bring people in, it kind of expands and moves people out of sight, and which I don't know why I'm explaining it, because it's not like
me.
But anyhow, so if you're joining us this evening, welcome. Feel free to list your church name and location you're listening from or watching from in the comments. And if you're watching this at a later time on YouTube, feel free to click the like and subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner. So tonight we're talking about handling medical emergencies, and we've got some folks hanging out here with us that I'm going to jump right to it because it's great to have them on board. So I'll bring Ryan in. Ryan joined us a few months ago. Ryan Burke with Tytek Medical. And then I also have Dr. Dustin Calhoun with us from down in Cincinnati. So welcome, sir. Thank you. And I'm going to actually just read through real quick Dr. Calhoun's background. And as we go through tonight, you're welcome to post questions or comments if you have any in the discussion feed, and we'll try and get to them the best that we can with the time. But Dr. Calhoun is based in Ohio, and he completed an EMS fellowship at UC, where he is now the Associate Director of the Division of EMS. And he is the Medical Director for Cincinnati Fire Department, as well as Bethel Tate Fire Department, Springdale, Washington Township, Oxford Fire Department, Fairfield Township, Cincinnati International Airport Fire, Cincinnati Police SWAT Team, and the Hamilton County Police Association SWAT Team. And he is an active flight physician with Air Care and Mobile Care in his spare time. So he is a very busy man, but he has graciously, and in fact, we actually, a few months ago when Ryan came on, we played one of the videos he created on tourniquets. And that was actually for last year, one of the most watched videos that we had, which kind of just indicated to us that people were really interested in learning more medical practices and that sort of thing. So, gentlemen, welcome again. And Ryan, why don't we go ahead and start with you? And if you could, for folks that maybe didn't see last time, just give us a little background for you and Tytek, if you don't mind. Oh, you are on mute at the moment.
I just noticed that. Yeah. I had to embarrass myself.
Silent films here, so
it's all good.
No worries. So I'm the Director of Emergency Preparedness for Tytek Medical. Tytek Medical started out by developing pre-hospital supplies for the military, and those supplies have now been made available to first responders and the immediate responder, the civilian, to preserve life from trauma injuries, severe life-threatening bleeding injuries, And my background clinically as a paramedic, I just hit my 20th year as a medic. So that's me in a nutshell.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Awesome. I'm just going to post your link here. So you do a lot of, I know you do a lot of conferences with church safety and safety and security in general. So I will post the link for Tytek. But if you have a church training or questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or the church safety guys, and we'll get you in contact with Ryan. He does a lot of traveling and does a fantastic job with his presentations. So I have had the honor of sitting in one of them, and I know he does a good job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So Dr. Calhoun, we'll throw it over to you. And I guess for starters, if you could just walk through how you got into EMS and emergency medicine, and what was your draw to that?
See, Ryan, I turned the mute off and then started moving my mouth. Yeah, I get that question a lot. A lot of people assume that I was a medic or something like that before medical school, and there are some fantastic medical directors and emergency physicians out there that was their route. It wasn't for me. I had actually planned to be a lawyer, do environmental law until going to, I worked as a I had a wilderness first responder certification, worked as a camp medic for a traveling field program, fell in love with it. Long story, a little less long. Wound up going to medical school, and sort of from day one there had a lot of interest in pre-hospital care, EMS, that sort of thing. Had some great mentors along the way that gave me those opportunities. And then things like tourniquets and preparedness, same sort of story, just the right place at the right time. Got some opportunities very early in my medical training to help out with some of the pre-deployment training that they were doing out of the Medical College of Georgia for the FBI back in the early 2000s. So got a sort of crash course in tactical medicine and stuck with that. And it sort of led me to working with Ryan, and I've learned everything else I've needed to know from Ryan since then.
Awesome.
It's like, you're lying.
Real quick, the story how we met, it's surprising we're actually still friends. I was working in the emergency department, and we had a code come in, and I was doing CPR, and Dr. Calhoun, who I had just met that moment, walked in and leaned up next to me and said, "Do you mind if I shock the patient when you're doing compressions?" And I said, "Yeah, I mind."
Now finish the story, though. Tell him what I did.
Well, I said, he goes, "It's perfectly safe." And I said, "You're more than welcome to." So he stepped up, did compressions. They shocked the patient, and he didn't hit the floor. So he proved that in that circumstance, it was okay. But, I left that room scratching my head. Who is this guy?
For the record, even I don't do that anymore. There's good evidence that it's just not necessary. But at the time, it was the thing to do.
That is incredibly awesome. I love that story.
That's one of the things I love about learning and being teachable is so much stuff moves forward over time. And there are things like CPR has evolved just in the last 10 years, just in the last 5 years. And understandings of tourniquets, and is quick clot as necessary as we used to think it. I mean, all this stuff is changing, and get in, sit down, buckle up, hang on, because this is always going to be changing. And I've had conversations with guys, and we all as the alpha crowd, we can fall into these traps of, well, I did this 20 years ago and I know everything there is to know. And it's like, it changes the weather. So I love the fact that you guys are bringing that up, because it's such a pertinent part. You can't just dip from the stream and assume you know it all.
That's absolutely true. In all fairness and all truth be told, I've learned a tremendous amount from Dr. Calhoun. One of my responsibilities working at the hospital he worked at was to ensure EMS had outreach and education. I've attended hundreds of talks and lectures by Dustin, and every time he talks, I learn something new. So, in all seriousness, it's phenomenal.
Cool.
Awesome. So we'll start. I do want to get into some of the hands-on type things like that, like wound packing and best practices and that sort of thing. But um, for starters tonight, let's back up a little bit. Our major, as you gentlemen know, our major application is for church safety teams and church security teams.
Yeah.
And so what I'm curious, or what I would be curious is, for a team that hasn't done anything yet, what would your recommendations be on some good equipment, some starter equipment, starter training, and maybe application of that equipment?
Sure. Yeah, I hate for things to come back to money, but for me, the big decision point is exactly what Paul was saying about QuickClot or not, right? Or any sort of, I shouldn't say QuickClot, brand name, right? Any sort of hemostatic gauze. I'm not saying QuickClot's better than the others. It's not actually, I carry a couple of different ones. But that's a big decision, right? Because that's a big cost sink right there. And the way I tell people to make that decision is, how much money do you have for what you want to do? If you have enough funding to put some sort of hemostatic gauze in every station that you should have, then do it. If you're going to have to limit the number of stations or sets of equipment you have in order to put some sort of hemostatic gauze in the ones that you do make, don't do it. I would rather you do a risk assessment of your facility, figure out where you should have equipment, and then if you can't put hemostatic gauze in all of them, then just put regular gauze in all of them and train with that. If it's going to make no difference, you're going to have the same number either way, sure. There is definitely some proven benefit to the hemostatic gauze. How big it is, I don't know. It is probably not worth $40 in my mind most of the time. But if you have the funding for it, and definitely not in my hands, in my opinion, to fail to be humble there, but I think that my technique, because I do it a lot, is pretty good. I think when you have folks who do it less, having that little bit of edge of a hemostatic substance may be beneficial. So if you can afford it and you're not going to limit, but if you're going to have to limit, if you're going to have half as many stations, that's probably not going to be your best bet. So a few tourniquets. In my mind, if you're going to put one tourniquet somewhere, you always put two. I never have a single tourniquet by itself. Plenty of gloves, right? People do more if they can protect themselves. So gloves, tourniquets, something to provide compression, whether that's a ACE bandage. Personally, I really, really strongly encourage, because the cost is really not that much difference, to get a purpose-built thing like the trauma bandage that Tytek makes. The big difference there, it's an ACE wrap, right? But it's an ACE wrap that doesn't unroll on itself when you accidentally let it go, which everybody does if you don't do this every other day. And once you unroll it, it becomes near useless. So the ability for that one to stay rolled up is a big difference. Something to shove in the wound. Personally, I like the Z fold or S fold stuff. I think that stuff is fantastic. If you have the funding to do it, then put some of the hemostatic dressing in each one. But those are really your big ones. Depending on how much training you're going to have, I like them to be medical stations as well. So if you can put some airway adjuncts there that your folks are trained to use and going to use, bag valve mask, if you have the folks that are trained to use it, can use it. I like to combine all of those things into a station. Something to provide warmth depending on the environment, right? If you're talking about, if you're going to if you have sort of an outside fellowship area and you're going to put something out there, put something to provide warmth, right? Put one of those chemical blankets or something like that. But it's going to be a little bit environment specific. Those are the big fundamental ones that are really, really low cost.
Nice. That's a lot of information. I hope you guys at home are taking notes, because, and I want to go back and then I want to hear what Mike has to say, because think about this. If you don't do what he does every day and you can afford a hemostatic agent, get it. And different things like this. Gloves are cheap. Gauze is cheap. ACE bandages are cheap. And get these things in those places. Think back to Sutherland Springs. Lives were saved with rags and know-how. So know-how's important, but you want to stack everything in your favor as much as you can. So if this is a trauma kit that's specific to an area and you've got the budget, get it all. So Mike.
Yeah, I think it's great information, and I think you start with a list of how many stations, how many places do you need to have it, to your point, Doctor. And I think beyond that is maybe you can only have a trauma bag at your soundboard or somewhere where it's quick access, and you start with hemostatic gauze there, and you can't afford to outfit all of the other stations. Well, keep track of where you didn't outfit, and maybe over time, maybe once a quarter, maybe once a month, maybe whatever, you can now upgrade each station one at a time. So, like for example, our church, we have a core trauma bag for the sanctuary, but we also have for our team a little kits, and it's a matter of, it's got the ACE, it's got the tourniquet, it's got hemostatic gauze in it, it's got medical shears, it's got gloves, and that's it. And they just wear it on their belt when they're on duty, that service. And the idea is that it's quicker access, it's immediately there. And we weren't able to make those kits right off the bat. In other words, it took us a little bit of time before we were able to assemble, putting together something to actually have on the person. But again, you have on person, you got something we got to put in the youth room. You got something as a trauma bag for sanctuary. Then there's something in the office. And then most recently, what we started investing in is putting a kit over in our coffee dispatch, if you will, because that's where people are consuming food or drinking or things like that. We want something in close proximity. And so we've started to fund that as well.
I was just going to just jump in real quick. And then I know Paul wanted to add something. Our facility, our church facility is about 130,000 square feet. And so we actually have three trauma kits and then 2 AEDs kind of spread out at different locations and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I've started doing is often I will be like the first responder, the first person that gets there. And so I'll throw a pair of gloves, a tourniquet, and, a couple of gauze bandages in my pocket. And to me, that's kind of the perfect assessment thing. So I can get there, I can kind of see what's going on. And then at that point, decide if, in our situation, if we need the trauma bag or something more serious versus running and grabbing that and then, not just kind of carrying it and going that route. So,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, it also kind of depends on what you're preparing for, right? If you're preparing for the person who trips and breaks something and the bone comes through and they're bleeding, or you're outside, that's one thing where you go get things. If you're preparing for, the unthinkable, the Philadelphia synagogue situation, then,
sure.
It's been shown that the run and get something just doesn't work in those situations as well. So, having them in many places becomes really useful. And I think Paul hit on a really good point, subtly, in that it's the know-how that makes the biggest difference. And that's a mistake in what I just said, right? I said the first thing is you decide, no. The first thing is you make sure everybody knows how to use the stuff, right? Because I could put you a whole trauma bay in the back part of your sanctuary, but if nobody knows how to use it, doesn't matter, right? So the more people in the church that know how to use the stuff that you have or know how to use the stuff that they have in their pocket, the safer you are.
Just as a quick follow, because there's so much to unpack here, as Mike says. So going back to know-how, I was at the scene of a rollover wreck, and I was just driving by. I do some first responding, and I jump out, and I have an ankle medical kit, and then I have a trauma bag. Not an EMT, not a paramedic, but I cannot tell you how many times I've been somewhere with that bag, and somebody that knew what they were doing was there. And I go running up, and I dump it on the next to a gal. She comes running up, and she says, "I'm a nurse." And I am reminded that not all nurses are created equal. And the same way that, if somebody's a doctor of psychology, they're probably not good at battlefield medicine. And I dumped this on the ground, and she looked at me like I'd grown a second head because she had no idea what to do with it. And that was really impactful for me, because there are many instances where a paramedic, Ryan, or an EMT is going to be better set. And I've seen, and now my wife is amazing. I've seen her at Rex. She's amazing, but not every nurse is created equal. So that goes back to knowledge and what do you know what to do with it? And then I'm going to hit these really quick. You mentioned, Dustin, about being able to stay warm. And I feel like I've overlooked this for years at times, where a space blanket's cheap. And if somebody's losing blood, and you probably have the stats for this, but by factors, you're losing by the clotting factor, you're losing body temperature, or actually the other way around, by body temperature.
10%.
You're losing clotting factor. Is it by degree? Is it 10%?
Yeah, 10% per degree Celsius of platelet and clotting factor function.
So let's think about that for a second. If you're laying on a floor that's 72 degrees and your body temperature internally is 98.6, you could die from exposure very quickly because your body temperature dropping is going to cause you to bleed out. So space blankets are cheap, and I think that many times we overlook that. And then and I wanted to go back to something you said, Mike, earlier, which is we've got all these ladies in our churches that they can come up and bend the ear of our boards. And if we still don't have the budget, where if the ladies are like, I love what you guys do, I love what you guys and gals do, and they're like, how can I help? Well, we need a budget, or we need help to buy these kinds of things. You know, Mike, to your point about building these things out over time. And I've actually had donors. Unfortunately, it seems like every time there's a major church tragedy thrust into the mainstream media, people would come up to me and say, what do you need? And I hate that it has to be that way, but we also enlisted those people's help in those moments. So,
well, and not to beat a dead horse, but to circle back to the hypothermia thing, you made a good point. You know, ambient temperature versus ground temperature, and we always think, is this person going to be cold in the fall and in the winter? But I'm telling you, there's people in Mike's world down in Texas in August that can become hypothermic trauma patients in the heat of a Texas summer. It absolutely happens. We have to think hypothermia for trauma patients in all times of year in all situations. Because once you lose that heat, go ahead. Once you lose that heat, you can't get it back.
That's completely about making sure people know that. Because even EMS, you said that you forgot that, Paul, but actually EMS and doctors and medicine has forgotten that for years. So that's a knowledge deficit that's out there that we're trying to correct, and it's easily fixed, right? If you're laying on a concrete floor, well, put some insulation there, right? Rolling whatever you can find, somebody's coat, some cardboard, whatever under you, tremendously reduces that heat loss. So that's all education. I think a fundamental part of any of this has to come back to as much education as you can.
For sure. One of the next things, and that was a great point that I think we could probably spend a lot more time on as far as necessity, what's basic stuff. Say a church or organization does have a budget, or they have a little bit more finances to work with. What would be like your next secondary type set of tools that you would encourage them to look at?
I think there are some advantages to doing things that are very uniform. So I'm a big sort of improvise, build things myself kind of person for my own kits. But when I'm outfitting an organization or something like that, I do like something uniform. So that part of the training is, here's where things are, here's where you find them, what they look like, so that you're not, digging around inside some bag trying to figure out what this particular thing happens to look like. Because I've seen well-trained people not recognize something that was just in a different packaging than what they're used to. So that would be one way to go, is having a very easy access uniform thing. Having some ability to move people around. They make some very inexpensive little litter kind of things that can be added to kits. The airway management stuff can certainly be added. I would like to think that things like Narcan aren't necessary in the church setting. But the other thing people have to remember is that Narcan's not always about intentional overdose. Little old lady who's got a broken hip and is on Percocet and forgets and takes extra dose that morning, or forgets that she took her dose and something else and takes a dose right while her hip hurts sitting in the pew. Now all of a sudden she needs Narcan. Right. So, that's a place that might be a little bit of an extra expenditure there that would be useful. But really, when you get beyond, it's going to start to depend on what personnel you have. If you have folks that can use more advanced airway stuff, that certainly can potentially benefit. But for the most part, the bandaging and things that we've talked about, the bleeding control stuff, unless you're going to have a really, really high level program, which comes with all kinds of other issues. Things like medicines and IVs are probably more complex than you want to get into. So really, if you have more budget, I would get into having more access to the same stuff and more frequent training, probably is where I would put most of that.
So something to the effect of, having like a pulse ox or blood pressure cuff or something like that. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but that's not what you wouldn't focus on it.
You got to sort of a big rule with just consider those tests, right? A pulse oximeter, a BB, it's all tests. And the big rule with doing a test is never do a test so you don't know what to do with the information. So if you, don't order it. I tell residents that all the time, don't order a test unless you know what you're going to do with the result. So if you have folks in the church that are trained to understand the information from that, great. What you don't want to do is, like, take my grandfather, for instance, right? His normal blood pressure, despite all of his doctor's efforts, is 180, right? Sure. They can't get it down. Well, if he forgets that that's the case, because he's getting that way lately, and someone at church takes his blood pressure and sees that it's 185, well, they might call 911 for that. And that's just not a great use of their time, his time, or the public resources. So you got to have some higher level finesse if you're going to get into those kind of things. But they certainly are. They're not high expense, and there are benefit if you have the right program for them.
Cool. Paul, you're gonna jump in there, and then we'll take a quick break.
So much here. I hope everybody at home is taking notes, because Narcan, there was a time when I didn't even think that Narcan would ever be a thing in a church. And at my church today, we had a guy come in, sit down. He was a bit of a DLR. It doesn't look right. We visited with him. He could make eye contact and hold a conversation. As the service was ending, he came up and was asking some questions. And myself and the security team director, we immediately pinged that he's coming down off something. And, I don't know if he did it there and we weren't able to observe it, but he was coming down off of something and starting to act erratic and so forth. And we made a judgment call. He asked for a ride across town. 2 members of the security team gave it to him, myself and another. And we moved put a potential incendiary device to a different location, because we didn't know what was coming, and we just kind of made a judgment call. But Narcan on site, and guys, I have never thought about the fact that sweet little Ina, that's been going to that church for 100 years, we used to have an Ina in our church, she could accidentally OD on something, and that Narcan, I'd never thought about it until this moment. I'd always looked at Narcan as OD due to illegal drug use, not OD due to a mental lapse or misreading a bottle. So guys, I hope you're taking notes on this. That just opened a whole new, setup for me.
Absolutely. I want to jump in real quick on before we go to break here on the training piece. Is we talk about a lot of the material, but the training is important. And I think it's as simple as, guys, for those of you leading teams, take your calendar, go out there and add on specific dates. Maybe it's every other month. Maybe it's if you have other things to rotate in, by all means. But you should be checking every single person. When's the last time they practiced in front of you self-applying a tourniquet or applied one to somebody else? You should be doing that, frankly, every single Sunday. Now, I happen to remember it this morning, so I grabbed the blue one, I throw it in my back pocket, and I'm like, between services, I literally just put my guys on the spot. Here, put it on, show me. And it was just that sort of thing. And it's like, you don't think of it all the time, but we got to schedule it so that we don't forget.
Well, and to your point, training is super essential, and knowing how to use that tourniquet just as effective as any one of your other tools is extremely important. One of the drills that we run with our law enforcement in the community is to have them take their tourniquet, close their eyes, use their non-dominant arm, and apply it to their dominant arm. When you're talking about wound packing, those wound packing legs can get a little expensive. All you have to do is have somebody close their fist, and you can simulate that fist as a wound and pack that fist. And you can do that in 10, 15 minutes before service, 10, 15 minutes after service, or during coffee time. It's very quick, very easy stuff.
One thing to add on there, I love the idea of doing the extra stress part of it, but think about stress inoculation. We do that with the cops. It's easy, right? Because we make them run. So we do lots of PT. You get done running, and all of a sudden I throw a tourniquet in your face. Actually, what I usually do is I say, you just got shot in your leg. Put your hand on your tourniquet. So they have to find their own gear and then put it on when you can barely breathe because you just ran up a hill. I don't know if that applies to how many different the safety groups you're talking about, but if you can come up with ways to put them under some form of stress and then do the tourniquet, it is amazing how difficult someone who is very trained at doing it, sitting at a table in a nice, quiet, calm position, can have a difficulty doing it when the blood is running somewhere other than their brain. So just one little added tip there.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'll mention this, and then we'll jump to a sponsor break real quick. But one of the things that we do often is when we do CPR training, it's exactly like you said. It's not here's a classroom, here's the floor, do compressions. It's okay. You're back in the kitchen. You need to run up here. Grab the trauma bag on the way and come in and do compressions for 10 minutes. We're on the southeast corner of Columbus, and I think we have an 8-minute average response time for EMS, which is great if our local station, is there. Otherwise, the next township over covers. Those guys do a fantastic job, but people in their minds don't always, when they're training, they don't always think 8 to 10 minutes. 10 to 12 minutes, they think, oh, I'll just do CPR for a couple minutes and then the person will be resuscitated, or, somebody else will show up. And we were very fortunate. One of the codes that we had, a gentleman actually collapsed on me. I walked up to him to ask him if he was okay because he looked, kind of weird, very pale. And he collapsed, and we picked up the phone, and there actually happened to be a Columbus engine literally outside our church that was done with a call, and they swung in. So we literally had, ALS on scene in probably 2 minutes of that call, and we're able to help. But, a lot of the churches that we work with, or the churches that might be listening to the broadcast, they have a 30 to 40 minute response time because they live in rural EMS, or rural EMS in a rural area. So being trained well for that and going the distance is important. I've even in EMS capacity, I've done CPR on someone for 45 minutes before, on the way to the hospital. So, it's definitely something to consider. But when we've got a lot more to cover and kind of go through, so we'll take a quick sponsor break, and then we'll be right back with you guys. So stay with us.
With over 50 years of experience with religious and nonprofit organizations, Thomas Alexander Insurance and Associates understands that your congregation is different from a traditional business. We're here to fulfill your needs, coming to you while creating a personal plan for your budget and size. From your local community to around the globe, we are advocates for you. Thomas Alexander Insurance and Associates, your partner in service.
Leading a church safety and security team requires more than showing up on Sunday mornings. It requires competent, engaging leadership. To operate a successful church safety and security team, it must be built on a solid biblical foundation. Be driven by a thorough system or structured framework and repeated consistently. Have you been tasked with starting or running a team? Have you inherited an existing team that needs a leader? Do you feel like you are running in circles or burned out executing tasks weekend after weekend? Then you need the all-new book from James McGarvey and Mike Scully, Engage, train, and retain. Embracing the church safety and security lifecycle to take your team beyond Sunday mornings. The church safety and security lifecycle is a 6-phase system created by the church safety guys specifically for leaders serving in church safety or security teams. It offers a practical leadership model so leaders can engage and inspire their volunteers, train and influence their team, and retain their talent so leaders can thrive, not just survive. So leaders can succeed, simplify their focus, and truly impact church ministry. This is not simply a startup checklist to do once. This is a repeatable framework of learning, discipleship and understanding, and applying a heart of ministry in church safety and security. Pick up the new Church Safety Guys book, Engage, Train, and Retain today, and take your team beyond Sunday mornings.
The Church Safety Guys is a nonprofit organization dedicated to help inspire, influence, and impact church safety and security teams. We are about all things church safety and security, which starts with a ministry mindset and a servant's heart. We're protectors, guardians, ambassadors, and shepherds. We help church and place of worship safety and security teams all over the United States through our broadcasts, online communities, conferences, trainings, resources, and products. Help us reach more churches in impactful ways by considering becoming a monthly ministry partner. $2, $5, $20 a month will help us continue to provide these resources.
All right, so welcome back. You're live with the Church Safety Guys, and if you are watching this on YouTube later or listening to it on one of our podcast hosts, feel free to like and subscribe or click that button on the lower right-hand corner. And as always, you can visit us on our website at churchsafetyguys.com, where we have resources and we have detailed descriptions of our broadcasts out there now. So if there's a particular topic that you want to share with your team, you can go back and kind of research that and look it up. So I want to jump back into the the conversation real quick with Dr. Calhoun about Narcan, because we seem to be getting a lot of questions about that. And I know Ohio has had several programs running where entities are gifted that to try and impact the opioid epidemic. And I know, like for my church, we've been gifted it because we run a homeless shelter as well as an actual church. And so we've gone through that training to use that. What is your thoughts about a church actually going through that and bringing that in as a newer tool?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, like we were talking about earlier, I like tools when people have the training to use them. And I think a church embracing Narcan demonstrates that it's not just about illicit drug use. I was using Narcan as a physician long before we had an opiate crisis on old people from nursing homes. Right? It happens. So that's one thing. The other big part, though, just like the trauma stuff, it's all about education. And there's a lot of not so great education around Narcan. I teach people that Narcan is a respiratory tool. It's not a mental status tool. Patients can be asleep all they want to and not respond to me all they want to, and that's fine. I don't like it when patients don't breathe properly. And that's when I use Narcan. So it's a respiratory tool. So if we teach people that it's for breathing, it's not to wake people up. And we also teach people that it's a secondary tool. Ideally, rescue breathing, which, basic first aid class teaches you that, whether you're doing it through a pocket mask or you're doing it through a BVM, if you have a program that's stout enough to teach that, which would be great. That's the first tool, while someone else goes and gets the Narcan, while someone else gives the Narcan. But Narcan is a second option to providing rescue breaths. So I think as long as you're doing that kind of education, I think it's a fantastic addition.
Cool. All right. I'll throw it over to Mike, because we did want to talk about mass casualty situations. And I know, you mentioned earlier the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and then we've gotten to know some of the folks down in Texas with some of the active shooter, church shooter situations there. So, Mike, what did you? I'll throw it to you.
Sure. I think when it looks in something that when the worst happens, when you get something hopefully short of Sutherland Springs, but something that you're not prepared for, something beyond the basic medical, something beyond a trip and fall or a heart attack, and it gets into more of a serious multiple casualty incident, there's both preparation that we have to do as church leaders, not just from a medical response, but considerations that I wanted to kind of put out there. And Ryan and Dr. Calhoun, if you want to add things that you can see into this from a standpoint of a church and a medical response and a tool and practical side of it, we'll continue that conversation. So I have 9 considerations. I recounted them. I thought I had 10. 9 considerations, but ultimately they're all C's. So I'll go through them rather quickly so that we have plenty of time for talking. So the first one, obviously, is in a situation like this, you need to have a plan in place ahead of time to establish some sort of command and control structure in your church. And that's not necessarily incident response, because, of course, EMS and whatever on scene is going to establish their own structure as well. But you need to have a staff control structure as to how are you going to respond, how are you going to work with your teams, how are you going to work to receive the casualty care as they come. Number 2, communication. You got to know what you're going to do, who's going to communicate to whom at that point. What are you going to do if there's multiple? You're going to have a press situation on your hands at that point as well. So you need to be prepared for who's going to handle press if that happens. Who's your backup if that happens? Number 3, corralling volunteers. You're going to have, in a situation like that, everybody wants to be helpful, and you're going to have what in the industry I think we call self-activation, where people are just showing up, and you need to be able to be prepared to understand what are you going to do with a glut of volunteers. Next one is capacity. Understand what your capacity is as a whole within your team, and understand what you can't do. And decide up front certain things are out of scope. You're just not going to be able to take that on. Know what that is. Next one, care. Your team is going to need water and food, and they're going to be working hard, and they're going to need care. So make sure you have some sort of hospitality or something that can help them along the way as they're dealing with what could be a several-day cycle. Contingency planning. Your community. Understand you're going to need your community. We've seen that in Sutherland Springs. We heard that from Pastor Frank Pomeroy, and that's important. Next, of course, cleanup. And then lastly, when all that is said and done, when EMS is gone, you're going to need mechanisms for coping with your team.
Yeah. Yeah. That's about 5 different individual broadcasts. Because we just hit all of the mountaintops at Mach 2. That's awesome. There's so much that we could unpack there, and it's not fair to try to even, that's all good stuff, because so much of what happened at Sutherland Springs or at different locations with mass casualties, that's so true. All of those things are important, and knowing when to step back. And like that video that we just got to watch, James, even the FBI agents, Mike, to your point, needed to go in and sit down and cope with and cycle through what they'd seen. And these are the people that see this stuff more than we do. and they needed a coping mechanism, and the church stepped up and provided it. So I think a lot of times, and I think I'm guilty of this, we think, oh, well, once the first responders are there and take over, our job is done. Not necessarily. Good point.
What do you gentlemen want to add to that, to the idea of multi-casualty type situations?
Yeah, I think that's a great list, and knowing how you integrate with that, because it's really complicated, right? You said a command and control structure there, and that's absolutely true. And knowing what the limitations are of that, what is that role going to be in sort of I guess being part of a unified command to some degree there with law enforcement. What is their role going to be? What is your role going to be? Some of the most important role may be providing to them that inside knowledge of the facility. Can you provide a list of how many people were there, who was there, having some sort of process in place to very rapidly figure out who is and who is not out and accounted for are big parts. And I think what Paul was saying about coping is really important, because those of us who see this, nobody sees, thankfully, nobody sees mass casualties all the time. But those of us who see sort of the less pleasant parts of this kind of thing frequently still have a really high potential to be affected by it when it's not in a setting you're prepared for, right? So I don't even want to think about how many people I've watched in really ugly situations or dying in an emergency department or even in the back of an ambulance. But seeing it in a different setting is an entirely different thing. The first time I ever went through a school shooting training that actually involved gunpowder, this smoke-filled hallway with actual students. We finally got students involved. So we had like 10-year-olds with bleeding wounds on them laying in a hallway filled with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. I had done a lot of training with a lot of weapons around a lot of different people, and it still affected me. So I think recognizing that can happen is really important for everybody.
For sure. There's and I want to jump in and comment on that real quick, and then I'll throw it over to Ryan. But absolutely, there is a massive difference. Like when we do the classroom training versus build a scenario, and we often where my church is, will have other law enforcement agencies come in, and we'll set up scenarios and kind of run through with them. And what I always find interesting with that is a lot of times the scenarios they bring into the church are things that we just never would have considered before, because our training and our resources is, they're focused on one thing. It's kind of like thinking about Narcan being used for an elderly person versus a drug addict. Yep. We've had situations where we've set up scenarios. Okay, you're responding through the church building to an active shooter. Okay, everybody kind of thinks through that in their mind. What would an active shooter be in their imagination? Well, what if the active shooter is a teenager or a child or a woman? We think of that often, like in that we've built this scenario-based situation with the training that makes us, make this assumption. But the reality is stepping back and saying what really could happen. Let's train to what could happen versus the standard, just popping the DVD in and watching. They've updated it. It's 90s emergency vehicles and accident scenes now. But Ryan, what's your thoughts on that?
Nope. Sorry, had to pause there in the internet. So, a lot was going on there. We all know in emergencies or disasters, communication is the first thing that fails. So, as you noted, Mike, integrating and identifying that command and control, the police, fire, EMS may not let you in their unified command, but they might let you have a liaison inside that unified command to assist and advise and that type of thing. Have those conversations early before something happens.
Absolutely.
The second disaster of a disaster is the volunteer and donation management. It gets absolutely overwhelming. So if you haven't partnered with the sister church, we have something at our church, will you handle the volunteer donation management side of things? Because we're going to be taxed doing other stuff. have that conversation with them. So just a lot of things, and a lot of getting to know who you're going to be working with ahead of the incident is key to many of this. Much of this, just like education is the key.
For sure. Mike, did you want to follow up with anything?
No, I think it's great. I think beyond that is, I'd say also is understand that if you're going to have a significant event at your church, we need to make sure that we have some contingency planning as well. What happens, and this isn't just for a casualty situation, this is what happens if you're displaced from your church building for more than 1 week. A lot of us have the ability to do an online service. That's great. But what if your service was being recorded from your building and you no longer can use it? What's your contingency? And that should be something that our teams are raising with pastors, raising with staff to say, what is our disaster contingency plan for any disaster? Anything that disrupts our ability to use our facility for an extended period of time, what are we doing? What's plan A? What's plan B?
That's your 10th C right there, Mike. Continuity of operations.
Exactly. There you go. Thank you.
Well, what's interesting, and I want to go back to Mike's point real quick. Having a contingency plan. Now, when COVID came about, we've been, obviously we're hopefully coming out of it, but when it first came out, our services were limited, and we went online. And every service, every ministry in the church, just a lot of it stopped because we were trying to assess, okay, what can we do? What can we not do? What can we do safely, etc. But what was interesting to me is we still were running that service, and we still had 50 to 60 people coming into the building at one time to actually do the service online for the folks watching at home. And so one of the things someone asked me was, well, why do we still need safety people there or security people there? And I'm like, because we're still doing something, right? Mm-hmm. So even though services change or the presentation of it changes, there's still people involved that at any particular moment could have a safety or medical emergency or something like that to be considered. So it's just because something has changed a little bit doesn't mean that it's not worth evaluating and assessing. Okay, do we adjust and adapt accordingly for what's going on? So, Paul, what were you were going to jump in there?
This is an amazing conversation, and we have to come back and visit this again because there's so much here. This is that less than 1% of a chance that's truly terrible. And guys, this could be the gal forgot which pedal was which, and I've talked about this before, and ran over 17 people, and you've got compound fractures and bleeding everywhere. This could be a propane tank exploded behind the building and through shrapnel. Fire, building collapse, hurricane, earthquake, tornado, meteor shower. It could be anything that causes mass casualty. And one of the things that, and I've seen this with command center structures, be prepared to have no access to your building. Be prepared to have to build relationships. Be prepared for people to come up to you and go, Mike Scully, I don't know where my daughter is. You better go find my daughter. And you're going, we don't have control of the scene. I can't tell you if your daughter is alive or dead. And and I was reminded of that watching Miracle on 4th Street. And I've been to the scene, not of mass casualty, but of drownings and various deaths and different things like that, really bad accidents. And I'll bring like Gatorade and different food like that and get to the edge of it. I've got somebody I liaise with and I dump it. And I've been invited in, and I'm like, if you want me to talk to somebody, I'll come in. But I don't need to come in just to get past the tape. And Ryan, Dustin, these are things that you guys deal with in EMS and law enforcement all the time, where people will do anything in their power to get in past that tape. And I don't know how many times I've seen people that they want to walk up and act like they belong there. They don't go to that. I'm going to use the church term. They don't go to that church. They have nothing to do with that. And they're going to try to push their way in. And unfortunately, I've seen those high stress moments where cops have gone, look at me. If you don't back up, you're going to jail. And people are going, I just want to know if my family's okay. And they're done. And I could see, and I know that sounds extreme, but I think for the folks at home, we could almost provide an extra layer in there and be a buffer and say, okay, Officer Scully, can I run crowd control interference for you? And, people come up and flag in, and I try to help you with things, because I've seen guys 36 hours into an emergency where they've not gone home. They haven't taken their boots off.
Mm-hmm.
And you're a doctor, Dustin, you know what's happening in their brain. It's like being inebriated. Their decision-making structure is messed up. And that's a very unpleasant thing. And that could be its whole own episode. But I think for anybody listening at home, we've got to think about these realities. I remember in Miracle on 4th Street, this lady talking about the fact that this officer was like, ma'am, I need you to go over there. Well, that officer didn't have any information. And then they finally came out and had information about her loved one, and it wasn't happy. And that's a horrible thing with 4 minutes left on the clock to lay out there. But this is part of the reality of what we're talking about, Mike, with how do we build in a structure, and we've got to have that grief counseling. When we lost our pastor over 2 years ago, I called board members and said, you guys have canceled church tonight. He died traumatically. People are going to show up ad hoc. We need to have people there. And we did, and people showed up. And we were able to minister in the moment to people that were hurting. And it was not a mass casualty event. It was the death of one person.
For sure. One of the questions that just came in, I'll throw this out to you guys, and you can kind of discuss it for a few minutes. But what Oscar asked, what is the priority of treatment for an elderly person with heart attack symptoms?
So that's a great question, because, as much as the other stuff gets a lot of our attention, that's probably one of the more likely things to see, right? It's not an uncommon thing. And the treatment is going to depend, again, on what level of capability you have. And what the patient is presenting with. But really, with heart attack symptoms, it comes again back to knowledge and training. So recognizing what those actually are, because the 60, 70-year-old guy who might grab his chest and give you the tight and everything else like that, that's everybody knows, right? Anybody knows that. But the 56-year-old, slightly overweight, diabetic African-American female who comes to you and says, I don't feel quite right, but it's a bit sweaty, that's one that you might not pick up on. So having that as part of good training is important, recognizing it, because to be honest, in most settings short of a hospital, there isn't a great deal that you can do. Knowing some of your local response capabilities, I rarely encourage people to try to drive someone to a hospital. It's a risky thing to encourage someone to do when you have somebody with pretty significant symptoms. Calling 911 is typically the better way to go. And most of the time when you're seeing heart attack symptoms, that's going to be the way to go, is having EMS come to you, because there's a lot of stuff that EMS can do in the field. Not the least of which is figuring out, is this the big one? And then activating their hospital capabilities so that their hospital is in parallel spooling up and being ready for their arrival. Whereas if you just drive them to the hospital, that hasn't happened. So it may in reality not actually save any time to getting the catheterization or something like that done. So really recognition of it, and then the real basic knowledge, minimize exercise, those kinds of things. If someone carries aspirin, having them self-administer aspirin is allowable by essentially anyone, as long as the person is putting it in their own mouth and making their own decision about it. And that's a relative, there are very, very, very few contraindications to taking a couple of aspirin. So that is incorporated in quite a bit of first aid training, but it really is mostly about knowledge and then knowing what your response protocol is.
I think that I'll throw it over to Ryan. I think that in itself is a topic for another broadcast. But just in the conversations I've had, just between the difference between a heart attack and sudden cardiac arrest, and seeing the symptoms there, a lot of times people, I know just from my history of training, that people are easy to confuse those and know what's really going on. But Ryan, go ahead.
I was just going to throw out, it's all about the basics. Back to the basics. Basic bleeding control, basic first aid knowledge, basic CPR knowledge, understanding stroke symptoms, understanding heart attack signs and symptoms, and getting 911 on the way sooner rather than later. Because there was a study, I think we talked about it last time briefly, about 3 or 4 years ago. The median time in a suburban urban area is 6 minutes from the time you dial 911 till the squad shows up. A lot of bad things can happen in 6 minutes. And if you're in a rural setting, that goes all the way up to 13 minutes. So having that basic knowledge and education to recognize when that's bad and start the ball rolling and is a huge key.
For sure.
I think aiding in that response as well is be prepared, whether that's one ambulance or the 10, is think about your facility, think about your buildings. Are your entrances clear? Do you have numbers or an alphanumeric system of some sort on your doors? Is your team prepared to go receive somebody at their closest door? Has somebody called into dispatch to let them know, hey, go to the Delta side of the building. It's clearly marked. That's the closest door to be able to get you quick access to the victim, whatever. That's another consideration. That takes a little bit more preparation. But again, time is important. And if they can get that bus around to the correct side of the building instead of having to go all the way through the lobby and all the way through all the way and then finally get there, you're going to get that care to that victim faster.
Yeah.
Well, and also keep in mind that if you're dealing with an active shooter situation or a hazardous material situation, that response time just got delayed even longer because everything slows down. So keep that in mind.
Sure.
Yeah, we could literally probably do a 4 or 6 hour long broadcast on this because there's so much here. And I want to hit one quick note, and then unless somebody has a comment, and I'll pray us out. We also need to think about emergency medical on the go, where you're on the creek, you're at the lake, you're miles from anything, you're out at camp, want to have fun this summer. You're at the shooting range, and it's a privately owned range. 2 times that I've been at ranges with some high-speed training, one guy got a slide bite that needed multiple stitches. How you do that, I don't know, but he did. And we were laughed at, myself and another guy that were high-speed enough to know that we needed to stage a vehicle, have designated medical personnel, have the vehicle turned the right direction, have a corridor for it to exit on. They weren't laughing when this guy was walking out of there holding his hand, and another guy fell, broke his shoulder, might have had internal bleeding. We had the GPS coordinates to the range. We were 45 minutes from the nearest hospital. I looked at this guy, and we effected self-rescue. We got him to the hospital, and they did surgery to repair his shoulder. And so you were talking about, and I live like super rural, and I think you kind of do. I think, Ryan, if I recall, this is a huge thing, because the farther you are from civilization, it's going to impact everything. And I've literally been jumping up and down on a road, waving at EMS who stopped in the road at a cross section, and they're trying to figure out how to get to me because dispatch is out of instructions. And I'm like, look for the idiot doing jumping jack, going like this. So,
flare gun.
All right.
Dustin, you got any closing thoughts? This is all good stuff.
No, this has been great. I think it's fantastic that you do this for this community. It's wonderful. Happy to help. Anything Ryan and I can do. I speak for him all the time. I'm sure he's just as excited as I am to help out with anything we can. But it really is that there are some simple basics that are very affordable. Training is relatively affordable. And you really can't beat knowledge when it comes to medicine.
It's much different than it was 30 years ago when I first started. I think the first CPR first aid class that I ever did was about a 36-hour class. And now we're down to like 4 hours. But I do know, like with Columbus, when we have, EMS respond, a lot of times the ambulances actually have more equipment than the emergency rooms do. If it's a smaller emergency room out in the community or something like that. So our situation, I feel blessed that we're actually, we have a good response teams and good infrastructure for that. But unfortunately, the area that I grew up in, we were 40 minutes from the nearest hospital, let alone a trauma center. So we used, and that was actually in New England, outside of Dartmouth, between Dartmouth and Boston. So often, we utilized the resources of Life Flight and different folks like that. But again, it was important staging it to say, this is what we've got going on. This is where we're going. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul, and you can close us out with prayer, sir.
I can. Mike, before I do that, I think you've got one final thought. I know we're in overtime, but I think it's worth it, guys. So go ahead, Mike, real quick.
Yeah, we're in overtime, but I know I've said this before, but something we've been stressing on the training side. In this area of certain training around medical and tourniquets and things like that, there are resources that are free for training. There are Stop the Bleed courses. There's FEMA stuff that you can get for free. And look for a local CERT team. That's Community Emergency Response Team. They're running free courses all the time, and a lot of that is field first aid, CPR, other sorts of components as part of that, plus tourniquet, Stop the Bleed. So there's a lot of resources you can get your team for free. You just got to look for it.
Amen. Well said. All right. Anybody got any closing thoughts? I'll pray us out. All right. Let's do this again. So, dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, I have thoroughly enjoyed tonight. I think it has been not only informative, but Lord God, it's opened doors and thought processes and that I'd never thought of. And so, Lord God, I thank you for these men, for what they do. I ask that you guide, bless, and protect them, that you would help this broadcast to reach the right ears, because Lord God, there's people who will hear this, and this can save lives. And I just thank you, Lord God. I'm humbled by what you're doing in this venue, Lord God, because I know it's impacting people for the better. We thank you for it in your Son Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So thanks for joining us tonight and watching. And as always, you can always visit our website at churchsafetyguys.com. For some great resources that we have available. Check out Mike and Mai's new book, if that's the correct. My grammar is
Mike and Mike's. What was that?
Right. But yeah, a great new book that he and I spent quite a bit of time on, just trying to help teams go a little bit beyond the standard topics for training. So we'll be talking about that more coming up. But until next week, if we can help you out at any way or in any capacity, please reach out, and we're happy to do so. So until next week, take care, God bless, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for joining the Church Safety Guys broadcast. We hope that you found it informative, and we appreciate your feedback. Looking for ways you can help us reach more churches? Share our broadcast with your teams. Consider becoming a monthly ministry partner. Like and share our page, and join the discussion in our Facebook groups. Visit our website at churchsafetyguys.com for other great resources. Remember to keep a servant's heart, a mindset of ministry, and Semper Disciplina. Always be training. Have a blessed week.